We're exploring the trailside geologic and natural history of Missouri's 240-mile Katy Trail State Park, following the old Missouri-Kansas-Texas rail line, here on Ozark Outsider. Here in part 2 of this series, we're riding the 88 miles from Sedalia to Jefferson City. See our introductory video for more on this project. This segment traverses the most diverse landscape and geology of the entire trail, with an abundance of interesting rock outcrops, plants, and other features to stop and appreciate. As the route heads northeast from Sedalia, it transitions from the Osage Plains of southwestern Missouri into the more rugged northern Ozark border region of central Missouri. You can see this clearly in the trail's elevation profile, where just past Sedalia, the gently rolling hills of the Osage Plains become deeper valleys and steeper grades as the trail descends from the uplands toward the Missouri River Valley at Boonville, which it follows the rest of the way to Jefferson City and beyond. As you ascend and descend the trail's elevation profile, you're also traveling forward and backward in geologic time, passing through a sedimentary sequence that's oldest at the bottom. Here's a complex-looking geologic map of the entire trail, where different colors represent groupings of differently aged rock. Most of the rock outcrops you'll encounter along this segment of the trail are limestones from the Mississippian period, especially in the rugged terrain surrounding the Lamine River Valley, and in the tall bluffs along the Missouri River around Rocheport. Down by the crossing of the Lamine River, there's some dolomite bedrock of the older Ordovician period, but heading east, you won't encounter this again until you're getting close to Jefferson City. The abundant outcrops of limestone and dolomite exposed in rock cuts between Sedalia and Boonville are full of neat features.
Ooh, there's some nice crinoids here.
Crinoid fossils primarily look like hollow beads stacked in a column, and represent the remains of a marine animal related to starfish and sea urchins. They're the Missouri state fossil, and are abundant in this region's Mississippian-age limestone. If you see lots of crinoids in rock that looks kind of like this, that's a pretty good clue of where you are in the geologic sequence. In this case, the Burlington Formation. Here's another interesting and recurring feature in the local bedrock. Down by the Lamine River crossing, we have a pretty normal bit of blocky-looking Ordovician dolomite bedrock. But if we pan around to the other side of the trail, what's this? Here, we have a lighter-colored, kind of rounded, almost bulbous outcrop that's clearly different. It looks like sandstone, and if we zoom in, it's pretty clear that it is a soft sandstone, of the kind that people unfortunately like to carve their names into. So why is there a thick chunk of sandstone sitting in the middle of what's supposed to be dolomite bedrock? It's not a layer of sandstone within the broader dolomite bedding, it's clearly cutting across the dominant horizontal bedding planes. If you've watched the Jefferson City to Augusta part of this series, you may recognize this as a sinkfill deposit, like the famous one at Standing Rock. They are a very old sinkhole or cave filled in long ago with sand. Here, almost 100 miles west on the trail, a similar process created a similar feature in similar Ordovician dolomite bedrock. It's pretty cool to think that the karst processes that help form today's cave-rich Ozark region were also operating hundreds of millions of years ago. Here's a related feature, this time higher up the sequence in a Mississippian limestone outcrop west of the Lamine Valley. This kind of rubbly, chaotic stuff looks like it might be fill in an old sinkhole or cave. It kind of reminds me of what we saw at the Rocheport Tunnel. In this case, the original cavity has been filled by broken rock, possibly by a collapse of the cave ceiling, rather than by fine sediment washed in from elsewhere. Like the crinoids, remember this when we get to the tunnel later in this video. At Boonville, the railroad crosses the Missouri River at a bridge site whose history goes back 150 years. The first bridge here was completed in January 1874, 6 months before the famous Eads Bridge across the Mississippi River in St. Louis. It was rebuilt on the same foundations in 1896, before a completely new bridge was built in 1932. Unfortunately, the trail doesn't extend across the whole bridge, instead using a detour over the nearby highway bridge. We have a separate video discussing the geography and history of the Boonville bridges, so we won't go into any more detail here, other than to say that this is one of our favorite sites along the whole trail. When the Lewis and Clark expedition ascended the Missouri River 70 years before the first Boonville Bridge, their journal entries repeatedly marveled at the diversity and ubiquity of edible plants in the region. Even today, despite drastic changes in land management, there are a surprising amount of native trailside edibles depending on the season. Filming this segment in September, we found persimmons, though not yet ripe, wild grapes, elderberries, pecans, black walnuts, and more. On an earlier ride in June, we'd found abundant tasty raspberries as well. The trail corridor also hosts interesting inedible trailside plants.
Oh, cool, there are liverworts in here. And at least a couple kinds of mosses. So this orange stringy stuff that almost looks fake, it's actually a plant. But it's a parasitic plant. So instead of being green and photosynthesizing, it's sucking its energy out of its host plant. Isn't that cool? Better yet, some of this daughter is parasitic on poison ivy. Isn't that great?
Anything that attacks poison ivy is beneficial along the Katy Trail, where that irritating plant sometimes grows out into the right-of-way.
Duck, it's poison ivy!
Trailside plants also provide habitat for insect life, such as this migrating monarch butterfly, this skipper butterfly on a chicory flower, or these beetles mating on a thistle. We also found these walking sticks mating on a trailhead sign. Do we need to worry about YouTube content rules? Once the trail crosses the Missouri River in its wide valley, it turns and follows that valley towards St. Louis. From here east, the dominant geologic experience is of bedrock bluffs lining the trail, some natural, some shaped by blasting during railroad building. From Boonville, through and past Rocheport, these bluffs are more Mississippian limestone, hosting extensive karst features like sinkholes, caves, and springs. Near this bluffside cave mouth, we noticed a crevice hosting a hive of feral honeybees. How cool is that? Lewis and Clark Cave, east of Rocheport, is a prominent trailside feature, though you should respect and protect it by not going past the sign. Nearby, perched on the high ground behind the bluffs, sits one of the state's largest sinkholes, from which Sinking Creek drains through the bluffs via Rocheport Cave and into the Missouri River. As far as we know, despite their proximity, these two features aren't connected. Some caves have a human component. This one isn't really a cave at all, but rather an open overhang that was walled off by the railroad as a storage facility for explosives. Speaking of humans altering the geology, back at Rocheport, you'll pass through the trail's only tunnel, indeed the only tunnel anywhere in the MKT's widespread system. This tunnel has a fascinating geologic backstory, which we've already covered in a pair of previous videos, so like the Boonville Bridge, we won't go deeply into it here. But you should definitely look for abundant crinoids in the rock cuts outside the western portal. Examine an area of rubbly fill within the eastern part of the tunnel. Remember the similar feature we saw way back before the Lamine River? Ask yourself why the eastern half is bare rock, while the western half is lined with cut stone and brick. And indeed, wonder why the tunnel needed to be built at all. Our award for best overall viewpoint anywhere on the trail goes to the Eagle Bluffs Overlook, a bit south of McBain. Here, you can lock your bike and hike a short but steep trail up to a bluff-top boardwalk, leading to an overlook offering a panoramic view of the valley, occupied here by the 4,400 acres of Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area, one of Missouri's premier birding and hunting destinations. Although most of the internal area isn't very accessible to cyclists, you can pull off next to one smaller area that often hosts interesting waterfowl. The Eagle Bluffs Overlook is a great vantage point for appreciating the scale and power of Missouri River floods. When we filmed here in 2023, Missouri was locked in a serious drought and Eagle Bluffs looked pretty dry. But the most recent major flood, in 2019, filled the valley here from bluff to bluff, a pretty comparable event to the more famous 1993 flood. From this vantage point, the Missouri River is actually at the far side of the valley, about 1.5 miles away. The 2019 flood ended up closing over 100 miles of the Katy Trail and doing serious damage that in some cases took several years to fully repair. The Katy's Missouri River line was built quickly and cheaply, squeezing its right-of-way between the river and the bluffs, but not high enough to avoid regular flood damage. Indeed, a flood in 1986 contributed to the final abandonment of the line and its eventual conversion into a rail trail. One feature that has survived centuries of Missouri River flooding stands near McBain, a short distance from the trail. This is the famous Missouri State Record Bur Oak, a tree over 400 years old. In other words, this tree was already middle-aged when Lewis and Clark went upriver, and has survived floods, lightning strikes, and vandalism. Step way back to appreciate its spreading canopy, then get up close to appreciate its massive trunk. The tree forms its own miniature ecosystem, all alone in a sea of corn and soy. This katydid seems particularly appropriate, or should it be a Katy doing, since we haven't finished the trail yet? As the trail heads southeast along the Missouri River, it also slowly descends with the river's gradient. This means that you're slowly dropping down through the geologic sequence as well. The dramatic outcrops of Mississippian limestone, which soar from trail to bluff top near Rocheport, slowly transition into the older Ordovician dolomites below them, which dominate the bluff line by the time you reach Jefferson City. Casual observers will be hard-pressed to tell the difference, but to a geologist's eye, they're distinct. But elsewhere along this segment, things aren't so simple. The local bedrock may seem flat, but a closer look at the geologic map raises some questions. For example, why doesn't the Ordovician rock at the base of the Lamine Valley show up again in the same elevation in hills above Boonville, instead of much lower and much farther down the trail? Similarly, why do the Mississippian rocks in the hills above the Lamine Valley show up again down at a lower elevation in the Missouri Valley? And if that weren't confusing enough, why are there younger Pennsylvanian rocks mapped on the slopes above Boonville, level with or below the older Mississippian rocks further west? The simple answer is these rocks aren't flat, but are folded and tilted as part of a larger structure called the Ozark Dome, which influences almost all of Missouri's geology. To learn more about that, watch our separate series on Ozark geologic history. But here, it's good enough to recognize that relative elevation is a good, but not perfect, predictor of where you are in the geologic sequence in this segment. Overall, from Sedalia to Jefferson City, you've descended well over 100 million years into the geologic record. Makes the 88-mile ride seem a lot shorter. We rode this segment over the course of 3 days, allowing plenty of time for trailside appreciation. But what's really cool is that, like other portions of the Katy Trail, you can also use bike-friendly Amtrak service to make a loop. In this case, we started in Jefferson City, took the train to Sedalia, and then rode back. In our parallel series, we discussed the logistics of completing this segment's bike rail loop, including how to cross the Missouri River Valley between the trailhead and the Jefferson City Amtrak station, some options for lodging, camping, and dining, and anything else we found interesting. Stick with us in this series as we keep exploring the trailside natural history of this fascinating rail trail corridor.